The dust hung in the air like a funeral shroud over the small frontier town of Cedar Ridge, Arizona Territory. It was 1887, and the unforgiving sun beat down mercilessly on the wooden boardwalks where merchants hawked their wares and cowboys sought refuge in saloon shadows. But none of this mattered to the man who walked through it all as if he were a ghost. He had no name, at least none that anyone in these parts had ever heard. The townspeople had taken to calling him the Silent One, or simply, that fella who don't talk. He'd been drifting through their territory for 3 months now, always moving, never staying anywhere longer than a few days. His clothes were worn but clean, his boots cracked but sturdy, and his hat pulled low over eyes that seemed to carry the weight of untold sorrows. Dr. Margaret Hayes, the town's only physician, watched him from her clinic window as he passed by for what must have been the 100th time. There was something about his gait, deliberate yet weary, purposeful yet aimless, that spoke of a man carrying invisible chains. "Morning, stranger," called out Tom Fletcher, the general store owner, as he swept his front porch. It was the same greeting he'd offered every day for weeks, and like every day before, the man simply nodded slightly and continued walking. Tom had long since stopped expecting a verbal response. The stranger's ritual was always the same. He would walk the main street from one end to the other, his keen eyes taking in every detail. Who was arguing with whom? Which children seemed hungry? Where trouble might be brewing? Then he would disappear into the desert beyond town, only to return the next morning and repeat the process. Martha Williams, the school teacher, had theories about him. "I think he's running from something," she whispered to her friend Eleanor over tea. "Look at his hands. They're not the hands of a drifter. They're educated hands, gentle hands. And did you notice how he always tips his hat to the ladies? That's breeding, that is." Eleanor disagreed. "No, I think he's searching for something. Someone. You see how his eyes scan every face in the crowd? He's looking for someone who ain't here." Both women were partially right, though neither could have guessed the full truth. The man they watched had once been Dr. James Sullivan, a respected surgeon from Boston. He'd had a wife named Catherine, a daughter named Emma, and a voice that could command a room with quiet authority. But that was before the fire, before the night when his entire world burned down while he was away treating patients in the next town over. The guilt had eaten away at him like acid. If he'd been home, maybe he could have saved them. Maybe his medical skills could have made a difference. The last words he'd spoken were to the sheriff who'd delivered the news. "I should have been there." Since then, his voice had simply stopped, not from any physical injury, but from a wound so deep it had stolen his ability to speak. Now, as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, James, though he no longer thought of himself by that name, found himself at the edge of town where the desert met civilization. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and the distant promise of rain. Clouds were gathering on the horizon, dark and heavy with the kind of storm that could turn the dry creek beds into rushing torrents within minutes. He pulled his coat tighter and began his trek back toward town. Something felt different today, though he couldn't name what. The air seemed charged with more than just the approaching storm. His instincts, honed by months of silent observation, were telling him that trouble was coming to Cedar Ridge. As he walked, he thought about the routine that had become his life. Wake with the sun, walk the town, retreat to the desert, return at dusk. It was a rhythm that kept him moving, kept him from dwelling too long on memories that could destroy what little peace he'd managed to find. But it was also a rhythm that had begun to feel hollow, like he was waiting for something to break it. The first drops of rain began to fall as he reached the outskirts of town, each drop hitting the dust with a soft patter that seemed to echo his footsteps. In the distance, he could hear the sound of horses approaching at a gallop, unusual for this time of day when most folks were settling in for supper. He paused, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver at his hip. It was a habit from his wandering days, when a man learned to be ready for trouble, or he didn't survive long enough to regret it. The gun felt familiar in his grip, though he'd never wanted to become the kind of man who needed to carry one. The riders were getting closer now, their horses' hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth. James could see them clearly now. 3 men in dust-covered clothes, riding hard and with purpose. There was something about their posture, their urgency, that set his teeth on edge. As they passed him without so much as a glance, he caught fragments of their conversation carried on the wind. "Should be alone tonight. Husband's away until tomorrow. No one to stop us." A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the cooling air. He'd heard enough conversations like this in his travels to know what they meant. Somewhere in Cedar Ridge, someone was about to become a victim, and these men were counting on there being no one around to help. James quickened his pace, his eyes scanning the town ahead for any sign of where these riders might be heading. The storm was getting closer now, and the early darkness it brought would provide perfect cover for whatever they were planning. He'd spent months trying to disappear, trying to become invisible, trying to escape the weight of his past failures. But as he watched those riders disappear into the gathering dusk, he realized that some things couldn't be escaped. Some things demanded action, regardless of the cost. The broken man who'd lost his voice was about to discover that there were still some things worth fighting for. The rain began in earnest as James reached the heart of Cedar Ridge, transforming the dusty streets into muddy rivers that reflected the occasional flicker of lamplight from windows. Most of the townspeople had retreated indoors, leaving the streets eerily quiet save for the rhythmic drumming of water against rooftops and the distant rumble of thunder. James positioned himself in the shadows between the barber shop and the bank, where he could observe the main street without being seen. The 3 riders had dismounted near the saloon, but they weren't going inside. Instead, they stood in a tight circle, their voices low and urgent. Even from his hidden position, James could sense the tension in their postures, the way they kept glancing toward the residential area on the far side of town. "The Thompson place," one of them said, his voice carrying just far enough on the wind for James to catch it. "Yellow house with the blue shutters. Remember, we wait until the lights go out, Sarah Thompson." James knew of her, a young widow who'd lost her husband in a mining accident 6 months ago. She lived alone now, trying to make ends meet by taking in laundry and doing seamstress work. Her husband had been away from town frequently for his job, and apparently these men had been watching, learning her patterns. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the men's faces for a brief moment. James recognized the type immediately. Drifters, probably wanted men, the kind who preyed on isolated settlements and vulnerable people. The leader was a tall man with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw, while his companions were shorter but no less dangerous looking. James felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away, to disappear into the storm, and pretend he'd never seen or heard anything. He'd spent months learning to be invisible, to avoid exactly this kind of situation. Getting involved meant risking exposure, meant possibly having to explain who he was and why he was here. But as he watched the men separate and begin moving toward the residential district, he found himself thinking about Catherine. She'd always said that good people had a responsibility to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. "James," she told him once, "your hands can heal, but sometimes the greatest healing comes from preventing the wound in the first place." The memory of her voice, clear and strong in his mind, made his chest tighten with grief, but it also made something else stir within him, something he'd thought had died in the flames along with his family. He began following the men, staying in the shadows and using the sound of the rain to mask his footsteps. The Thompson house was about a quarter-mile from the center of town, sitting on a small rise that would normally provide a good view of the surrounding area. Tonight, however, the storm had reduced visibility to mere yards. As he got closer, James could see the warm glow of lamplight in the windows of the small yellow house. Sarah was home, probably unaware that 3 dangerous men were closing in on her. The thought made his jaw clench and his hand tighten on his revolver. The men had taken positions around the house, one by the back door, one watching the front, and the leader approaching the porch. James realized with growing urgency that they were preparing to move. He had minutes, maybe less, before they acted. For a moment, he was paralyzed by indecision. He could try to warn Sarah, but that would mean speaking, breaking the silence he'd maintained for so long. He could try to scare the men off, but 3 against 1 were poor odds, especially when he had no idea how skilled they were with their weapons. Then he saw movement in the front window. Sarah Thompson appeared briefly, a slender woman in her mid-20s, with dark hair pinned back and wearing a simple blue dress. She was moving around her small living room, probably tidying up before bed, completely unaware of the danger surrounding her. The sight of her, so innocent, so vulnerable, made James's decision for him. He couldn't speak, but he could act. And sometimes, actions spoke louder than words anyway. He began moving closer to the house, using the storm and the darkness to his advantage. The man watching the front was positioned behind a large oak tree, his attention focused on the front door. James approached from behind, his movements silent and deliberate. When he was close enough, he struck quickly and efficiently, using the butt of his revolver to render the man unconscious. The thug crumpled to the ground without a sound, and James quickly dragged him further into the shadows. 1 down, 2 to go. The back door guard was next. James circled around the house, staying low and moving carefully through the muddy yard. This man was more alert, constantly scanning the area around him. James would have to be even more careful. He picked up a small stone and threw it toward the far side of the yard. When the guard turned to investigate the sound, James struck again. The man went down hard, and James quickly bound his hands with his own belt. 2 down, 1 to go. But the leader was the most dangerous, and he was already on the porch, his hand on the door handle. James realized with growing horror that the man was about to enter the house. There was no time for stealth now. James sprinted toward the front porch, his boots splashing through puddles and his heart pounding. He reached the porch just as the leader was pushing open the door. "Sarah!" Eddie the man called out in a mockingly sweet voice. "Don't be afraid, darling. We just want to talk." James heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath from inside the house, followed by the sound of something being knocked over. She was trying to run, but there was nowhere to go in the small house. The leader stepped inside, and James followed, drawing his revolver. The man was standing in the doorway to the living room, blocking Sarah's escape route. She was pressed against the far wall, clutching a kitchen knife with trembling hands. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't have anything valuable. Just take what you want and go." The leader laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Oh, sweetheart, you've got exactly what we want." "Gee." James stepped into the room behind him, his revolver trained on the man's back. The floorboard creaked under his weight, and the leader began to turn. "What the—" The confrontation was about to begin, and James knew that the next few minutes would determine whether Sarah Thompson lived or died. He'd found his voice might be gone, but his ability to protect the innocent was still very much alive. The storm raged outside, but inside the small yellow house, a different kind of storm was about to break. The leader spun around, his hand moving toward his gun, but James was faster. In one fluid motion, he struck the man across the temple with the barrel of his revolver. The thug staggered but didn't fall, instead lunging forward with a snarl of rage. "You picked the wrong night to be a hero, stranger," the man growled, his scar seeming to pulse in the lamplight. James said nothing, couldn't say anything, but his actions spoke volumes. He sidestepped the man's clumsy charge and brought his knee up hard into the attacker's solar plexus. The man doubled over, gasping for air, but managed to grab James's gun hand and twist it away. Behind them, Sarah pressed herself against the wall, her eyes wide with terror, but also something else: amazement. She'd never seen anyone move with such controlled violence, such precise brutality tempered by obvious restraint. The two men crashed into her small dining table, sending dishes flying. James managed to break free and landed a solid punch to the leader's jaw, but the man was tougher than his companions. He shook off the blow and pulled a knife from his boot. "I'm gonna cut you up real good," he snarled, slashing at James with the blade. James backed away, looking for an opening. The small living room didn't give him much space to maneuver, and he was acutely aware of Sarah's presence behind him. He couldn't let the fight move in her direction. The leader pressed his advantage, driving James back toward the front door with a series of knife thrusts. James managed to avoid the blade each time, but barely. His shirt was sliced open across the chest, and he could feel a thin line of blood where the tip had found its mark. Then lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room in stark white light, and James saw his chance. In that moment of distraction, he grabbed the man's wrist and twisted hard. The knife clattered to the floor, and James drove his elbow into the man's throat. The leader stumbled backward, clutching his neck and making choking sounds. James followed up with a devastating uppercut that lifted the man off his feet. He crashed into the wall and slumped to the floor, unconscious. The room fell silent except for the sound of rain against the windows and James's heavy breathing. He stood there for a moment, looking down at the unconscious man, his body still coiled with tension. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. You saved me." James turned to look at her, and she saw his face clearly for the first time. It was a strong face, weathered by sun and hardship, with deep lines around his eyes that spoke of recent grief. But it was his eyes themselves that captured her attention, dark brown, intense, and filled with a sadness so profound it made her chest ache. "Are you hurt?" she asked, noticing the blood on his shirt. James shook his head and touched his chest briefly. The cut was shallow, nothing serious. He was more concerned about her well-being than his own minor wound. Sarah set down the kitchen knife she'd been clutching and took a hesitant step toward him. "What's your name? I want to thank you properly." James looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the struggle in his eyes. His mouth opened slightly, as if he was trying to speak, but no words came. Instead, he simply shook his head. "You can't talk?" she asked gently. He nodded, his expression pained. There was so much he wanted to say, so much he wanted to explain, but the words were locked away somewhere deep inside him, buried under layers of guilt and grief. "It's okay," Sarah said softly, moving closer. "You don't need to say anything. What you did, what you just did for me, that says everything." She reached out tentatively and touched his arm. He flinched slightly at first, as if he wasn't used to human contact, but then stood still and let her gentle touch remain. "Let me clean that cut," she said, indicating the wound on his chest. "It's the least I can do." James started to shake his head again, but she was already moving toward the kitchen. "Please," she said, looking back at him. "I'm a nurse. Well, I was before I got married. I know what I'm doing." Something in her tone made him pause. There was a strength in her voice that hadn't been there during the attack, a quiet competence that reminded him of Catherine. He nodded reluctantly and sat down in the chair she indicated. Sarah returned with a basin of water and clean cloths. As she began cleaning the wound, James studied her face. She was beautiful in a quiet, understated way, with kind eyes and gentle hands. Her touch was professional, but caring, and he found himself wondering about her story. "I don't even know how to thank you," she said as she worked. "Those men, if you hadn't been there..." She shuddered and didn't finish the sentence. James reached out and briefly touched her hand, his eyes meeting hers. The gesture was simple but profound, a wordless communication that said he understood, that she was safe now, that she didn't need to think about what might have been. "You're not from around here," Sarah continued, applying a bandage to his chest. "I would have remembered seeing you before. Are you just passing through?" James nodded, then hesitated. The truth was more complicated than that. He'd been passing through for months, but something about this place, this moment, made him wonder if he was ready to keep running. "Well," Sarah said, finishing with the bandage, "I'm glad you were here tonight. I don't know what I would have done without you." James stood and moved toward the unconscious leader. He checked the man's pulse, still alive but out cold. He looked at Sarah and pointed toward the door, then made a gesture that clearly indicated she should stay inside while he dealt with the situation. "You're going to turn them over to the sheriff?" she asked. James nodded and began dragging the leader toward the door. The other two men were still unconscious where he'd left them, and it would be easy enough to get them to the jail. Sheriff Davidson was a good man who would make sure they couldn't hurt anyone else. As he reached the door, Sarah called out to him. "Wait!" He turned back and she hurried over to him. In the soft lamplight, with her hair slightly disheveled and her dress wrinkled from the struggle, she looked younger and more vulnerable than before. "Will I see you again?" she asked. James looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. There was so much he wanted to say, so many things he wanted to explain, but the words wouldn't come, and perhaps that was for the best. He was a broken man, carrying too much pain to offer anyone, especially someone as good and pure as Sarah Thompson. Instead, he simply touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of farewell and stepped out into the storm. The rain immediately soaked through his clothes, but he barely noticed. He had work to do, and then he would disappear again, just as he always did. Behind him, Sarah stood in the doorway, watching him drag the first unconscious man toward town. She wanted to call out to him, to ask him to stay, but something in his posture told her it would be useless. He was already gone, even though she could still see him. But as she watched him disappear into the darkness, she realized that something had changed. The silent stranger had saved her life, but in doing so, he'd also given her something else, a reminder that there were still good people in the world, people who would risk everything to protect a stranger. She just wished she knew his name. The rain had stopped by the time James finished delivering the 3 unconscious men to Sheriff Davidson's jail. The lawman had asked the obvious questions. Who was James? What had happened? Where had he found them? But he'd quickly realized that the silent stranger wasn't going to provide any answers beyond pointing to the obvious evidence of the men's guilt. "Well, I reckon these boys won't be bothering anyone for a while," Sheriff Davidson said, looking at the bruised and battered prisoners. "Whatever happened, looks like they got what they deserved." James nodded and turned to leave, but the sheriff called out to him, "Hey, stranger, don't know who you are or where you came from, but Cedar Ridge owes you a debt. If you ever need anything—" James paused in the doorway, his hand resting on the frame. For a moment, the sheriff thought he might actually speak, but then he simply touched his hat brim and walked out into the night. The main street was deserted now, the storm having driven everyone indoors. James walked slowly toward the boarding house where he'd been staying, his mind replaying the events of the evening. He'd broken his own rule. He'd gotten involved, drawn attention to himself, become part of someone else's story. But as he thought about Sarah's face, about the relief and gratitude in her eyes, he found he couldn't regret it. Some things were worth the risk, worth breaking the carefully constructed walls he'd built around himself. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed the air clean and left the world looking fresh and new. James woke early, as was his habit, and prepared for another day of his endless routine. But as he stepped out of the boarding house, he noticed something different. People were looking at him. Not with the casual indifference he'd grown accustomed to, but with something approaching respect. Word had spread quickly through the small town about what had happened at the Thompson place. The details were vague. No one knew exactly what had transpired, but everyone knew that the silent stranger had somehow saved Sarah Thompson from 3 dangerous men. "Morning," Tom Fletcher called out from his store, his greeting warmer than usual. "Fine day, isn't it?" James nodded, touched his hat and continued walking. But he could feel the eyes following him, could hear the whispered conversations that started when he passed. "That's him," he heard Martha Williams say to her friend. "The one who saved poor Sarah." "Doesn't look like much," her friend replied. "But I guess looks can be deceiving." James quickened his pace, uncomfortable with the attention. He'd worked so hard to remain invisible, to be just another face in the crowd. Now he was the subject of speculation and gossip, and that made him want to run. He was so lost in thought that he almost didn't notice the figure standing in his path until he nearly walked into her. "Good morning," Sarah Thompson said softly. James stopped abruptly, his eyes meeting hers. She was dressed in a simple green dress, her hair pinned back neatly, and she looked much more composed than she had the night before. But there was something in her expression, a combination of gratitude and curiosity, that made him want to turn and walk away. "I wanted to thank you again," she said, "for what you did. I know you don't like attention, but I couldn't let you just disappear without saying something." James nodded uncomfortably and started to step around her, but she moved to block his path. "Please," she said, "just give me a minute." He stopped, looking at her with wary eyes. She was standing close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender soap, close enough to see the small scar on her chin that she probably got as a child. "I keep thinking about last night," Sarah continued, "about how you risked your life for someone you didn't even know. That's not something you see every day, especially not in a place like this." James looked away, focusing on a point somewhere over her shoulder. He didn't want to be reminded of his actions, didn't want to think about the implications of what he'd done. "I don't know what brought you to Cedar Ridge," Sarah said, her voice gentle but persistent. "And I don't know what you're running from. But I want you to know that what you did mattered. You saved my life, and I'll never forget that." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I made this for you," she said, holding it out to him. "It's not much, but I wanted you to have something." James looked at the package for a long moment, then back at her face. Very slowly, he reached out and took it from her. The paper was soft and neatly folded, and he could feel something solid inside. "It's a shirt," Sarah explained. "I noticed yours was torn last night. I hope it fits." James stared down at the package in his hands, his throat tight with emotion. When was the last time someone had given him something, thought about his needs, cared about his well-being? He couldn't remember. "I know you probably won't stay," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Men like you don't stay in places like this. But I want you to know that if you ever change your mind, if you ever decide you want to stop running, Cedar Ridge could use someone like you." James looked up at her, and she saw something shift in his eyes. For just a moment, the walls came down, and she glimpsed the man he'd been before, whatever had broken him. It was a man who'd been loved, who'd loved in return, who'd known happiness and purpose. But then the moment passed, and the walls went back up. He nodded once, touched his hat brim, and walked away. Sarah watched him go, her heart aching for reasons she couldn't fully understand. She'd known him for less than 24 hours, but somehow she felt like she'd been waiting for him all her life. James walked to the edge of town, the package clutched in his hands. He found a quiet spot under a cottonwood tree and carefully unwrapped Sarah's gift. Inside was a simple white shirt, expertly sewn and sized to fit him perfectly. Pinned to the collar was a small note written in careful script. "For the man who saved me. May you find whatever peace you're searching for. St." James held the shirt up to the light, studying the neat stitches and careful construction. It was beautiful work, made with obvious care and attention to detail. He could imagine Sarah sitting up late into the night, working by lamplight, thinking about him. The thought made his chest tight with an emotion he'd almost forgotten: hope. He changed into the new shirt, folding his torn one carefully and placing it in his saddlebag. The new shirt fit perfectly, and the soft cotton felt good against his skin. But more than that, it felt like a gift, like someone cared about his well-being. As the sun reached its zenith, James found himself at a crossroads, literally and figuratively. The trail out of Cedar Ridge stretched before him, leading to new towns, new faces, new places to hide. It was the path he'd been following for months, the path that had become his life. But behind him lay something different. Behind him lay a woman who'd looked at him with kindness instead of fear, who'd seen past his silence to the man beneath. Behind him lay a town that had begun to accept him, to see him as more than just a drifter. James stood there for a long time, the desert wind ruffling his hair and the sun warming his face. He thought about Catherine and Emma, about the life he'd lost and the guilt he carried. He thought about Sarah Thompson and the gratitude in her eyes. He thought about the choice that lay before him. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, James finally moved. But instead of heading out into the desert, he turned and walked back toward town. He had no words to explain his decision, no voice to declare his intentions. But sometimes, action spoke louder than words. That evening, as Sarah Thompson sat on her porch watching the sunset, she saw a familiar figure walking down the main street. The silent stranger had returned, and something in his posture told her he wasn't planning to leave again. She didn't call out to him, didn't wave or try to get his attention. She simply watched as he walked past, noting the way he moved with less urgency, less desperation. He was still broken, still carrying whatever burden had stolen his voice, but perhaps he was ready to start healing. As he disappeared around the corner, Sarah smiled. She still didn't know his name, but she was beginning to understand that some things were more important than names. Some things were more important than words. Sometimes the most profound truths were spoken in silence.